Welcome back to the swamp, my friends, and welcome if you're new. Today I'm going to be sharing some creepy and downright strange deep woods horror stories that'll freak you out tonight. As always, if you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, don't forget to send it on in at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to see your story and potentially share it in a future episode. Now, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and get ready for these creepy and downright strange deep woods horror stories that'll freak you out tonight.
So I have submitted 3 stories to you, and you have graciously read 2 of them on your channel. My name is Evan, and the 2 stories you read were about cryptids, and so is this story. The difference is that this story is from my mom's point of view. As I stated in the last 2 stories, I live in rural Maryland, but my mom grew up in the mountains of Tennessee. Her father was an avid hunter and cared for his family very well. They lived on a large section of woodland near a dirt road, in a log A-frame home. Her father worked at car auctions and was often gone for weeks at a time on road trips with his team. This led to my mother Lisa becoming a very accustomed person to exploring the woods with her sister. Her mom took care of the property, but also worked at a local restaurant 4 days out of the week. Again, this left my mom and her sister with the task of occupying themselves. My mom loved the outdoors and the woods surrounding her home. It was perfect for exploring. Her father whittled a small wooden slingshot for her, and she would spend all day shooting pebbles at the creek and climbing small trees. Now, this encounter took place when my mom was 9, in July of the year 1979. My grandma had taken my mom's sister to the doctor because she had sprained her ankle the day prior and was having trouble walking. My mom decided, like most days, that she would do some deep woods exploring. She grabbed her slingshot and set out. Her mom called after her to not be too late for dinner. The sun was already getting low in the sky, and the thick trees didn't help this matter. My mom wasn't scared of the dark. She ran through the brambles, singing and stopping every once in a while to shoot her slingshot. She eventually got to the creek and sat down on the soft bank to refill her pebble supply. As she was picking up pebbles, she heard a noise. Whenever she retells this to me or any sibling, she always says, "It's like the crickets lost their voice and the birds had no more songs to sing." The forest was utterly silent, as she recalled, and she didn't realize why at first. She got up from the creek bank. Standing across the creek on the other side of the bank is what she called a big hairy man. She wasn't familiar with the stories about Bigfoot, but she knew this was no human. It looked at her and she said it felt like it was staring right through her soul. Then it let out a massive, guttural call that she felt in her chest. She tried to cry, being a little girl in the deep woods with a Bigfoot in front of her. As if the thing realized it scared her, it stood up to its full height and she realized it was only kneeling. She said it must have been 6 feet tall while on its knees, but around 9 feet standing up. As my mom turned to run, she heard it let out another call, even louder than the first one. My mom got back to the house in record speed, and her clothes were torn and her legs were bloody from tripping twice. When my grandma asked why and what had happened, she said she fell from a tree. I don't think she thought my grandma would believe her. She never told this story until maybe about 5 years ago. I was shocked but believed her because my mom is no liar. So, that's her story. I appreciate you sharing my stories I've sent you, and I hope you can share this one as well. I hope you're doing well during this crazy time, and be safe out there, folks, because there are some things that we just can't explain in life. I am an avid outdoorsman and a fellow swamp dweller. I was once a well-known outdoor survivalist YouTuber from the early years of YouTube, when 10K subscribers was a lot. So, I won't be using any names just in case a few of you may remember us. This took place in Florida back in 2010 during the summer. Me and 2 friends were camping on the Alafia River, on a bend in the river not too far downstream from a county park built around a local spring. We loved the spot, and went there frequently in the early years of our channel. The area is much more developed now, and since we made videos out there, the place lost its charm as more and more people have discovered it. We seldom go back now. This particular trip, we decided to camp right on the river in a spot that afforded a beautiful view of it, and the surrounding flora and fauna. To get there, You just had to follow the trail that eventually went down an embankment and turned to run along the river for a dozen yards or so. We usually camped atop said embankment and even had semi-permanent shelter up for a while, but decided to go down and set up camp along the river trail instead. We set up camp, gathered wood, started our fire, cooked, drank, and relaxed. Night eventually fell, and we all turned in around the same time. I believe it was around 10 p.m. or so. We had of course been telling stories of the skunk ape, which is Sasquatch's smaller and smellier cousin from Florida. I have an odd habit of not being able to sleep much when I go camping unless I am the first person to fall asleep. If not, I kind of just doze off and wake up every few minutes. I'm never really ever asleep. In this case, I was not the first one out. I soon heard soft snoring from the other tent shared by my two companions on this weekend trip. So I settled into a comfortable position in my little dome tent and drifted between wakefulness and sleep for a few hours, always keeping an ear out. One thing about rainy Florida summer nights is the sounds of the swamp. Being right off the river, there was a constant cacophony of frogs, toads, crickets, and the odd nocturnal bird, all screaming into the night as they try to get laid. While it can be loud, there is a natural rhythm to it that I enjoyed. There were even some coyotes yipping somewhere off and across the river from us. Suddenly, all the sound ceased. I came fully awake and laid still for just a moment, eyes open as I tried to puzzle out what was off. It was when I heard the gentle trickle of water from the river that I realized everything had gone quiet. I sat up and tried my best to peek out from under the rain fly of my tent, which was covering the screen. I would normally be able to see out of it, but I could not see more than just a sliver. It was so dark outside, it really didn't help anything either. I heard crunching and the rustling of leaves on the embankment above us, in the spot that we would normally camp. I listened for a moment, figuring it was either the raccoon I had chased off earlier with a slingshot, or, even more likely, an armadillo, which was abundant in our area and can make enough noise in the brush to make you think it was a bear charging at you. It was then that I noticed the crunching was following the pattern of a person walking through the brush on two legs, not the slithering rustle of a small game moving around. At this point, I figured either one of my companions was up trying to spook me, or a local had come out and was walking around at night with no flashlight, which was a pretty disturbing and questionable prospect in and of itself. The footfalls moved across the embankment above me, towards the top of the trail that led down to where we were. My tent was set up in the grass at the base of the trail, right where it leveled off and turned to follow the river. My companion's tent was set up a few yards away on the left of the trail. The footfalls made it to the top of the trail and stopped. They were maybe 10 or 12 feet away from where I sat. My trepidation grew as seconds passed in eerie silence. There was a sudden loud crack of wood from the embankment above me. The unmistakable sound of a tree branch being whacked and broken against the trunk of a tree. I knew this for certain because we had been doing the same thing earlier in order to break down large dead branches of firewood. Another whack sounded, this time closer to my tent. I reached over and quietly scooped up my large Maglite LED flashlight and my machete. I placed them both in my lap as I sat up. I was sitting cross-legged, waiting patiently. I usually carried a pistol with me, but left it in the car on this trip for a reason I can no longer recall. The footfalls at the top of the trail started again, one after another. This time I could feel the weight of them in the seat of my pants as they came. This thing was heavy. The ground vibrated with the thump under its weight with each step. My skin began to prickle as my neck and ears grew hot with the sudden rush of fear. The footfalls stopped within an arm's reach of my tent. I listened hard and thought that I could make out the faint sound of something breathing quietly, ragged, in the darkness outside. I knew it was focused on me. The crushing weight of its attention drove me to near panic, as though some long-forgotten instinct woke inside me and knew that I needed to get out of here. It needed me to run. It's the only survival. My breathing grew rapid and shallow, my chest tight as I continued to listen to the dead silence outside of my tent. Then as suddenly as it came, the dreaded weight lifted. I felt and heard the thing move past me down the trail towards my friend's tent. The frogs and crickets resumed, causing me to nearly jump out of my skin at the sudden rush of sound. As the thing moved past me, I was able to will myself to the flap of my tent where I slowly unzipped it enough from the top corner in order to get my flashlight through. I clicked my flashlight on and kept a tight grip on my machete as the bright LED beam lit up the night like a white mini sun. I swept it back and forth and saw nothing of what had just passed. Still too scared to get out, I zipped my tent up and resumed my cross-legged position. For the rest of the night, flashlight and machete held across my lap in case it came back. Dawn came 2.5 hours later. I heard the zipper of the other tent open, so I also emerged. I saw my friend exit his tent, bleary-eyed as he moved off into the thicket of bushes to relieve himself in the pre-dawn light. I approached and asked him if he heard anything last night. He said he did, but he figured it was me walking around trying to creep them out. Told them it wasn't. He kinda shrugged it off and went back into his tent. I stayed outside and searched for signs of the thing, and I found nothing. No tracks or depressions in the ground. No bent or broken branches or twigs. No tufts of fur or hair. Nothing. When my companions fully awoke and emerged from their tent for breakfast, I addressed it with them again, and they again said they just thought it was me walking around. I described what I felt, but only got looks of disbelief from them. Something to note about this experience: there was no smell, which is something of a telltale sign of a skunk ape in the other folks' accounts of running into one. The only thing that really points it to being a skunk ape would be the tree knocking, and the one thing that makes me dismiss it as a person was the feeling of dread that it brought with it. I have never felt anything like what I did that night. I had once been stalked by an elusive Florida panther, and it was nothing close to this thing. What was it? I may never know. Camping and hiking in the backcountry has always been my passion since I was old enough to go out on my own and travel to different locations. I've been fortunate enough in my life to be able to go to some of the most remote and beautiful places in the United States. Needless to say, I've seen some pretty strange things, and at times I've been downright terrified of the encounters I've had out in the bush. I've always believed in the supernatural and the unexplained, having grown up in an extremely haunted house which sat on an old Native American reservation, but that's a story for another time. With all that being said, I still can't begin to explain what happened to me and one of my closest friends in the mountains of Arizona one night. After a long week of work, my friend John and I decided we would go to a well-known mountain range just north of Phoenix to hit up some of the off-road Jeep trails and spend the weekend camping at one of my favorite spots. For obvious reasons, I won't disclose the exact location, but if you live in the area, you probably know exactly where I'm talking about. After a few hours of driving across the rough terrain, we finally arrived at the trailhead. We parked our Jeeps and gathered our gear and began our half-an-hour hike to the campsite. The trailhead is not well known or heavily used at all. I've gone to the spot for years, and hell, sometimes I still drive right past it if I'm not looking hard enough. After a while of hiking, we finally reached the campsite. Now, this place is absolutely beautiful. It's right on the edge of the mountain overlooking the Salt River, and usually, there's not another soul for miles. I've made countless solo trips here and have always felt at ease, even after a close encounter with a mountain lion coming inside of my camp. But this time, I don't know, something was definitely off, and I could tell that John felt it too because he was a lot more tense than usual and seemed to be on high alert. We tried to brush it off and ignore it as best as we could, and got our campsite set up. After a few beers and sitting around a small fire later that night, we started to relax just a bit. It was starting to get late, so I decided I was going to call it a night. Just as I started to stand up, a rock the size of a baseball comes hurling out of the wood and nails a tree right beside my feet. What the heck? I stood there stunned for a second, before reaching for my rifle. John jumped up and pulled out his pistol. "Hey, if there's someone out there, you better make yourself known right now," I yelled as I and John started walking in the direction that rock came from. We got no reply. No sound of footsteps, not even a slight breeze. It was dead silent. So much that my ears were ringing. After a few minutes of investigating the area and finding absolutely nothing, we returned back to the fire and decided it best to stay up and be alert for a little longer in case something else happens. About an hour goes by and John and I are starting to calm down and are just sitting around talking. All of a sudden, A large tree branch flies out of the trees and lands on John's tent, ripping a massive hole in the roof. We jumped up and both aim our guns in the direction that the branch flew in from. We fire a few rounds. Maybe this was not a good idea, but we did it anyway. We hear something massive tearing through the trees. At first we thought it was running away from us, but we realized it was running a circle around us. We shined our lights in all directions, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever or whoever this was messing with us. At this point, we were both shaken up and started gathering what we could to stuff in our packs and get the heck out of there. John grabs my arm and says, "Stop. Do you hear that?" He started looking back towards the edge of the mountain. At first I didn't hear anything, but after a second I could make out a low hum. It was a very low but high-pitched whistle that was vibrating the ground slightly, but it was coming from about 50 feet past the edge of the mountain. Like, there was no possible way anyone or anything could be out there, unless it could fly. I started walking towards the sound slowly, scanning the tree line around me. As we slowly moved towards the edge, I lift up my light and shine it towards the unexplained sound. As I did, rocks and large sticks and even parts of a cactus flew in from off the edge, bombarding us. It was like shrapnel. We ran the full 30-minute hike in about 10 to 15 minutes to our jeeps and threw the few things we managed to grab in the back and just hauled absolute ass out of there. We never went back to the tents, and I haven't been camping in that place ever since. I've heard a lot of scary stories about that area, ranging from Bigfoot to UFOs and even skinwalkers. But after those events, I still have no idea what terrorized us that night. I don't plan on going back to find out, but if you live in the area and know kind of where I'm talking about, if you are unlucky enough to stumble upon an abandoned campsite at the edge of a mountain, do yourself a favor, turn around and go the other way. Hello there. I've been listening to your program for a while and decided to share this. Maybe another listener has had this happen to them, because I still don't really know what this was. I grew up with acres upon acres of woods behind my house. A farmer owned most of it, but no one paid mind to us. There were huge fields on both sides of the woods, and the farmer at one point had trails going through the woods to move cows from one pasture to the other. My brother, sister, and I would regularly be found playing out there. There was a creek back there too. We could fish or swim, or muck-luck, or whatever you want. Muck-lucking is basically playing in the mud, catching frogs and salamanders. We'd been out there in any weather, any season, in the daylight, in the dark, you name it. I used to hike the woods on moonlit nights as a kid and was quite comfortable in its surroundings. The location of my home was in southeastern Pennsylvania, Chester County. The area still had plenty of open space at the time, and wildlife was really just foxes, raccoon, deer, squirrel, etc. Nothing too scary or aggressive, and the coyotes hadn't come back at this point. I'm about 10 or 11 when this occurred. My friend Haley and I had been hiking for most of the morning and had gone up through the hills, through the woods to the top of the pasture. The trees were less there, and they had these huge vines that we used to make swings out of. We had hung out for a while and then headed back down the hill towards the woods. The day was sunny and clear and a really nice autumn day. As we entered the woods and made our way to the trail, the clouds started to move in. It got grayer and a little cold. Nothing major. Haley and I were enjoying shuffling through the leaves, and it sounded like the sound of the leaves were being echoed, like we'd shuffle and something would shuffle behind us. I stopped and told Haley that something was copying me. She shuffled forward and said, "See, I'm not copying you." After she shuffled, we heard the leaves move behind us up the hill a bit, and we both turned to see if it was a deer or something else. But what we saw was something entirely different. It was like a man deer or a deer man or whatever you would want to call it. It was coming right towards us. We know how protective they get, and we knew that the buck could get a little gnarly too. So, as we were looking, we hear the lowest growl that made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. Haley grabs my arm and we slowly start backing up. I swear on my mother's grave that we backed up You could see the leaves moving like something was walking through them, but we couldn't see them actually move. It was only about 30 feet away, and we would move behind trees to try to get a better look while backing up. I was trying to rationalize it in my brain by saying it was just a deer. The leaves moved out of the way of whatever was walking through them, and it was large. It kept coming down the hill just behind us, and the growl came again, louder this time. A growl that rumbled in my chest. We turned tail and bolted it out of those woods as fast as we could, and it felt like this thing was close behind. I can remember Haley falling when we reached the line between the woods and my backyard, and I remember dragging her by the arm until she caught her feet. I was still trying to catch a glance and trying to see if I saw anything, but I still saw nothing chasing us. We ran straight to the house and hid, looking from her bedroom window. We had a clear view from her window to our woods, yet nothing ever came out. We didn't go into the woods for a while, and even so, we only enter a couple of feet before we'd feel like we were being watched. My brother and his friend had a similar run-in, but luckily had their quads. They were further in the woods and were fishing, just like our day. He said it started to get cloudy and colder, kind of out of the blue, and he said he heard someone on the trail further down. This is opposite of where the trail goes from our house. It's deeper in towards a waterfall. He said it sounded like someone was riding their horse down towards them. He called out to them because he didn't want the rider or the horse to get spooked since everything is kind of on a bend. Instead of a voice, a growl was the response. He then said he and Gary didn't waste any time. They left all their tackle and poles and flew home on the quads. I hadn't told my brother about what happened to me and Haley, but I think these occurrences are definitely connected. What do you guys think? It was near the end of 2018, sometime around November, so it was damp and pretty cold out, but nonetheless still comfortable for me when I got a call from my friend Joe. He wanted to come up to my house and stay for a few days to get out of the city, so to speak, because I live up in the mountains. The usual middle-of-nowhere type old wooden house with my mom, who rarely was home for more than 2 to 3 hours at a time due to her job in the mountains of Tennessee, yada yada. You know, backwoods areas, you've heard this story a million times. We have neighbors, but they're a good distance from our house, so we don't know them all that well. Enough details for now, though. So I get off the phone with Joe and proceed to drive to the city where, of course, me and him hang out for a while and play some video games, and slightly we lost track of time. When we left, thanks to the time of year, it was already dark. It was maybe around 6:30 to 7 p.m. when we got back to my place, and it had begun sprinkling rain on the ride up, but we get there no problem. We go in and start setting up the game stations to begin the night of games and movies. Typical stuff we did. It's around 10 p.m. when we have everything set up and slight rain had subsided, so we opened up the window to cool the room a bit. The backyard is dark, and I mean dark. It leads straight into the woods beside the small shack in my yard. But it never bothered us because we were halfway through our movie when I and Joe both heard a faint metallic-like sound coming from the woods, which caused Joe to pause the movie and ask if I had heard the noise. I said I had, so we had listened for a moment and heard it again, but it sounded closer. It was windy, so I blamed it on the wind, and plus we have a tin roof, but we resumed the movie and kind of forgot about it, until about 30 minutes later when we heard it again, but this time much louder than before. It sounded like someone hitting a metal baseball bat against a tree. So I paused the movie again, and I and Joe just look at each other and decide to stay quiet and turn the lights down and take a look out the window. We saw nothing but keep hearing it move around the woods, so to speak. We started getting a little freaked out, but turned the movie back on and lowered the volume mostly, as a ploy to act as if we were ignoring it again. But we were really listening intently to the outside noises, and the sound quickly stopped. They now transitioned to the side of my house, just under the opened window. We froze, and for what felt like 5 minutes straight, we just stared at my window, seeing nothing but the darkness and slight glow of the floodlight coming from outside the house. We soon saw a shadow in the light, and then all at once the light shook and went out. We turned and ran into the front room and grabbed the light and anything we could use as a non-lethal weapon and bolted outside to the area from which the sound was coming from. It was coming from just under the window, but there was nothing there. There was no sound, no light, but my floodlight was unscrewed in on my porch, which really freaked us out. So I quickly put the light back up, and we had a brief look around when it began raining pretty hard. We stopped our search and came to the conclusion that whoever or whatever unscrewed this thing was gone. We assumed it didn't want to stay in the rain, as we didn't either. We got back inside thinking about what had just happened. As I went to look out the window, I saw what looked to be a man standing in the dark looking at me from behind the shack in my backyard. I was scared, I won't lie. But I kept talking to Joe as if I didn't see him. I walked over to Joe, who was at my desk, and I calmly told him what I saw, and retrieved the 9mm handgun I had for home protection due to previous incidents. I stow it in my lap, and hoped that whoever it is outside would just leave. It seemed like he had, for about an hour, until we heard loud footsteps on my porch near the floodlight, and then a series of loud banging on my wall, right where we were sitting. I stood up and cocked my handgun when I saw the outside light go out again. I moved to the window and shoved nearly my whole upper body out of the window and fired at least 7 shots right under the house outside the light. I saw the man run into the woods wildly off into the dark again. Silence and darkness crept over us again for the remainder of the night. We kept the lights on and the window shut, and nothing else happened. All has been quiet ever since. This story takes place in a small town called Leadville, Colorado, in 1976. We had just relocated there from Texas, and this town was surrounded by a national forest. We needed a place to rent, and my parents found a mobile home on the outskirts of town. We would be renting it from an older woman and her adult, albeit creepy, son. We quickly got moved in, went and bought groceries, and began our new life. It was not even a full week till we had come home from a day out. My dad's job was hunting, and we also were trying to do a little sightseeing. So Mom and I would tag along with him. It was starting to get late, and my mom noticed that the lock to the front door was not locked. She always was vigilant about locking doors, never leaving windows open, etc. It was not like her at all to accidentally not lock a door. Apparently though, my dad just dismissed this as a mistake on their part, and not that someone had let themselves in. Upon inspection of the trailer, nothing had been stolen, and everything looked to be in order. My mom began to set about making us dinner. She had poured herself and me a glass of orange juice, of which I had yet to take a sip because I was, distracted by something else. She then pulled out some milk as well, maybe to mash potatoes with, I'm not sure. But when she poured the milk, it looked like it was curdling and not right. This whole time she had been drinking her juice, that is when she started feeling dizzy and unwell. She then grabbed the glass she poured me and tossed it into the sink. She yelled to my dad that something was wrong and she felt bad, and that she needed to get to the hospital quickly. We got in our van and drove off. I do remember her seeming to sort of fade in and out of consciousness. I remember being upset and I was crying some. We got to the emergency room. She had enough strength to say that she believed that she had been poisoned, and then they took her off to where they pumped her stomach. As my mom was getting evaluated to see if she could be released and Dad filing out paperwork, the nurse asked for their address. When my dad gave the address, the lady had this look of shock and horror on her face. She then advised my parents to try to move as soon as possible because everyone in town had bad feelings about the woman and her son. There had been missing people that had passed through town and potentially rented from those people never to be seen again. Apparently, there was never enough evidence to show any wrongdoing, but the townsfolk felt that they were responsible. There was no toxicology done, as this was 1976, but she feels strongly that someone had tampered with our food in the fridge. When we returned, my dad said that the man we had rented from was outside of the trailer looking our way. Keep in mind, by now, it would have been the wee hours of the morning. My dad said he grabbed a change of clothes for us all, loaded the van, and tried to just get out of there as fast as possible. Apparently the guy walked over as my dad was loading up, asking if there was a problem. My dad said the guy had a rifle slung over his shoulder. When my dad mentioned why he had a rifle, he said something about skunks or pest wildlife. My dad said that he would be coming back tomorrow to get the rest of our stuff and was no longer renting.
My dad said the guy looked very angry, asked why. My dad said that he and my mom decided to move into town rather than be as far as we were. We were about only 15 minutes away though, but, it's a good excuse anyway. The guy looked inside the van, commented on me and my mom asleep, then said he would not be returning their rent or deposit. My dad said fine, whatever, and then got in and drove us to a motel for the remainder of the night. We went back the next day, and it was then obvious that all of our stuff had been looked through. Again, door left unlocked. Nothing was stolen, but clearly had been looked through. My parents threw out all the groceries they had purchased and gathered all of our stuff. Luckily, we found a small apartment in the downtown area. We never really talked about this again, and when I became an adult, I didn't really look into it much until recently. My parents then shared with me our horrible experience when I asked one time, and I often wonder if these people we rented from were responsible for what happened to my mom, or was it just bad juice or something else? Or were they just some sort of psychos? I won't ever really know, I guess. The 70s were full of drifters, hitchhikers, and hippies, who I guess go missing and are not missed. But I think we got lucky that nothing worse happened than what did. I live near a very large, very popular national park. Locals here, like myself, are pretty aware of the ongoings here. Strange sounds, strange creatures, and strange disappearances. I have dealt with these myself in the past on hikes and even just relaxing in the park. Here is one that still freaks me out to this day. I was at my grandma's house that's deep in the boonies. The only road that goes there is this gravel road that is pretty much washed away, so without a good car you're not getting up there anyways. My cousins lived in a trailer with their moms right below my grandma's. We played all sorts of games which mainly involved me getting chased. I was the youngest. My grandma was in the hospital with my aunt, so our older cousin, who I'll name D, had to watch us. D was and still is the only cousin that's older than us that we still hold in high regard. He would mess with us and play around, but actually cared about us. The whole day we would be playing around, but we usually play more at night, like hide and seek, tag, etc. We had been playing pretty far away from the house and it had just started to get dark. We decided to go back to the house and grab flashlights and play manhunt. Of course, I was the one being hunted. I ran pretty far into the woods on the other side of the property and hid behind a log. I heard my cousins getting close, so I ran, and they saw me. We ended up running to the very back of the property line, almost a full mile from the house, and we saw my cousin D. He looked at us and kinda growled, and we all ran from him, thinking it was a game. We ran back onto the gravel road and we saw him walk out of the tree line. But when he did, he kinda had this weird, kinda gloating way about it. I don't know. We ran to the house and decided to barricade the door to play a prank on him. We moved a couple of things in front of the door but decided to move the big coffee table in front of it too. As we loudly scooted the table across the floor, D came into the living room from the master bedroom rubbing his eyes. We had obviously woke him up from all that movement and he was mad. We told him about seeing him chase us and he got wide-eyed. He told us to go to our bedroom and stay there. We sat in the bedroom for about 20 minutes and he came in and told us not to worry, that it was just him scaring us, and we went on with the night. It wasn't until about 3 years later when I was 13 that he told me the truth, that it was probably a Skinwalker. He told me that he's dealt with it more than one time, and when he was our age, he told me his story, which I may share as well someday, depending on how far this goes, I guess. This is of course just one story. I have quite a few more. Be careful out in those national parks. There's just something out there. This is an experience I had that occurred in April of last year, almost an entire year ago. My mother is a traveling nurse and often gets assignments in Alaska and other less populated states, so I usually travel 3 to 4 times a year to go see her. This was my first time going to see her in Alaska. She was staying in Fairbanks for 3 months. While she was at work, I would take her rental car and explore Fairbanks and the neighboring areas and towns. Side note, Alaska is very sparsely populated and the towns of just 1,000 or more are considered somewhat large. One particular day, I decided to make the long day trip to Denali State Park via AK Highway 3, or Parks Highway, as it's often called. It is a long, windy, stretching road connecting Fairbanks to the outskirts of Anchorage, Alaska's largest city. Along the fairway from Fairbanks to Denali State Park, you pass through 3 or 4 towns, the largest of those being Nenana, which only has a population of 365. Once you get out of Fairbanks, it gets really lonely. I remember driving 40 to 50 miles without passing a single car. You kind of get mesmerized by the beauty of the landscape and the snowy, icy mountains surrounding you, and forget that you're in the middle of nowhere. Quality phone signal is few and far between when you're driving through this area. It was a weekday and off the tourist season in Alaska, so most of the vehicles I passed were log trucks or semi-trucks and the occasional regular motorist. It was early April, and there was still heavy packed snow on the side of the roads and in the forest and valley, but the roads were completely clear. From Fairbanks to Denali National Park, it is a 4 to 5 hour drive depending on road conditions. My main goal was to see Mount McKinley, the tallest mountain in North America. I hadn't really researched much of how to see it, but it was harder to see it in April than the summer months. There is a road that leads into the national park where you can see a view of Mount McKinley, but I had passed it not knowing whether the conditions were good or not. I had looked on Google Maps and it showed there was something like a scenic view or overlook that you see on the American interstate sometimes. I assumed you may be able to see Mount McKinley from there. If you go on Google Maps, it is across from Byers Lake Campground. The campground appeared to be closed or desolate, but there were no gates or anything from stopping me to enter that point. It was at this point that I completely lost cell reception and my GPS on my phone wasn't working. As I pulled into the campground area, there were probably 16 to 24 inches of snow on some of the roads there. Some of the roads had been plowed, so I assumed there had been people visiting, but there were no cars or anyone in sight. There are a bunch of winding roads that almost resemble a maze that lead to a dead end. Now, for the entire 4+ hours I had been driving, not once did I have any uneasy or bad feelings. When I am usually in desolate areas, especially the desert, I have really bad vibes, but it wasn't like this in Alaska for some reason. That had changed about 30 seconds into entering the campground area. Maybe it was the fact that I was turning into some abandoned campground, or the fact that I am completely lost with no cell reception, but something didn't sit right with me. But I was determined to see Mount McKinley, and I was trying to focus on that, and finding a good place to take some cool pictures. I had drove down these winding roads and hit dead ends, and then suddenly it started to get really cloudy. I was getting more frustrated at not finding a good area to take some pictures, and then I realized I was lost. It is not far at all from the main highway, but I was lost. I started to get really confused about exactly where I was, and my GPS wasn't working. So I started to panic a little. I made my way down this dirt road to the lake and there was a large opening. My bad feelings went away temporarily because of the view. It was so beautiful. The lake was completely frozen and behind it in the background was a small snowy mountain. The scene was just something straight out of National Geographic magazine, so I stepped out to take some pictures. I stood there for a few minutes just admiring the beauty of the Alaskan wilderness and was looking at my pictures to see if they were good when I heard this scream in the distance. It was a close scream, but it sounded muffled, almost like something was able to control the volume of their voice to make it seem far away, but in reality, it was close. My heart started racing as I looked around to try and find what it was. Everything in my body was telling me to book it for the car and find the way out, but I just stood there confused and kind of scared. I felt like I was being watched and all the hair stood up on my arm. I was wondering if it was a bobcat or a mountain lion, because they are often mistaken for women screaming. I look out the far side of the lake and see this person wearing a light orange jacket and jeans. They had a green beanie on their head. I waved at them and they waved back immediately, Then this overwhelming feeling of dread and terror entered my body. I was wearing a light orange jacket, jeans, and a green beanie. The person had brown skin like me. I'm half Filipino and half white. I couldn't make out the facial features, but I feel like I could see black hair sticking out of the beanie, which is the color of my hair. I just stand there for a few seconds, frozen in shock and fear, and then I noped the heck right out of there. I hightailed it up the hill to my car and basically did a donut in the snow, spinning tires trying to get out of there. I started panicking, was trying to find the exit. I saw a sign that was almost completely covered in snow, but had an arrow pointing to the left, and I came out to the first part of the campground. It was a bathroom facility and an office, and it had a veterans memorial statue. There was this white owl just perched on top of it, staring at me with its head just sideways, like bending over. I found the way out and sped the entire way back to Fairbanks, checking my rearview mirror every 10 seconds. I do not really know what to make of the situation. As I entered civilization, I came back down and didn't really have any other weird experiences in Alaska. I've considered the thought of it being a Skinwalker or an Aswang, which is Filipino shapeshifter in folklore, but I'm not sure. This happened around August of last year in Yosemite National Park. I'm not sure what we experienced or if it was anything truly odd at all, but I thought it was weird. So this was a hike up to Half Dome, and we had a campground about 20 minutes drive away from the trailhead, and the group we composed of was me, who's an 18-year-old male, my uncle, who's a 32-year-old male, and my uncle's friend, I'll call him D. There were 2 girls with us, but they aren't relevant to the story. My uncle and his friend are both Christian, so there were no substances consumed that could induce the feelings I will be talking about. We got to our campsite, set up camp, and got to sleep after eating. We planned to wake up at 4 and start the hike by 4:30. I randomly wake up at 3:30 a.m., like I'm completely wide awake, and look out of my hammock, and I remember feeling this odd feeling as if I was woken up by something, and I remember looking out at this moonlit scene. The moon was very bright for some reason, and thinking to myself, it was like a dream. I lay back in the hammock, but can't go back to sleep. I end up waking up my uncle and his friend at 3:50. My uncle asked me, "Were you walking around?" This is important, and I say no and ask why. He says he woke up for some reason and could hear someone walking around. Not like an animal, but a person. Huh, I say, that's weird, and we brush it off. We get to the trailhead at around 4:30, and as everyone is unloading from the car, D says he's going to use the bathroom, which there are a couple of them before the trailhead. I walk behind him for some time before falling behind and waiting for my uncle who forgot something in the car. The short straight road from the parking lot runs directly into a T intersection with the road to the trailhead, and the bathroom is directly across from the intersection through a little field. Those who have been there know what I'm talking about. We get to the intersection and wait for D to come out of the bathroom. We wait for about 10 minutes before I go and check the bathroom. He isn't there. I get back to my uncle and tell him that. He says weird, maybe he went back to the car or something, and we decided to wait a bit more. By 5:10 we begin to worry. My uncle goes back to check the car while I wait at the intersection to make sure we don't miss him if he went down the road away from the trailhead. My uncle returns, says he isn't there either. We decide maybe he went up to the trailhead without us for some reason, and walk up, and about 10 minutes later, we still haven't found him. He isn't there either. We are kind of baffled now, because there are no logical places he would go. I decided to run back and check the car and the bathroom again. I meet him halfway before I get to the intersection. He is sweaty and disheveled, with a weird look in his eyes. I say, "Where have you been?" He says he went to the bathroom, and when he got back to the intersection, we weren't there, and he just assumed we went to the trailhead and started walking, and then he met me. I say, "What do you mean? We waited at the intersection for half an hour, checked the car, the bathroom, the trailhead, and you weren't there." He says, "Well, I don't know. I went to the bathroom." He then asked me where my uncle is. I say at the trailhead. He then asked me, I'll tell him again. And note that it was weird he asked me twice. As we're crossing the bridge to the trailhead, he sees a light off the riverbank and exclaims, "Oh, maybe that's him." And I just look at him and keep walking. I thought his behavior was very strange, like he wasn't thinking straight. We finally get on with the hike, and then it goes by as normal, except that we seem to keep losing things, such as my uncle's small red flashlight, one of the girl's gloves, a water bottle, etc. It's like we just simply forgot about the items and couldn't remember where we could have left them. On the way back it got dark and we turned on our flashlights, and as we near the end of the hike, after the 2 waterfalls, it begins to seem as if we've been walking for far too long. My uncle also confirms this, asking me, "Doesn't it seem like it's taking way longer to get back?" I say, "Yeah, I was just thinking that." We keep walking, but it still seems like we're making way too many steps and not making any progress. I've been on that trail many times, and I was walking and I couldn't spot any familiar landmarks. It was weird. There was this odd feeling in the air, sort of like a slight menacing feeling. It's hard to describe. I remember thinking it feels like the woods are alive. We remark 3 more times about how long the hike is taking, and began to laugh at it because it felt so ridiculous. After a bit, we finally and suddenly found ourselves on the final stretch and make it back to the car. Now all of this seemed odd at the time, but I just brushed it off. I only realized how weird those events felt after we got home, and my aunt asked my uncle, "Were you camping?" And he says, "Yeah, how'd you know?" As we didn't tell them where we were going, as it was kind of last minute. She says that she had an odd dream, where she sees my uncle in a tent in a forest somewhere, and someone is outside of his tent. She says she couldn't see who it was, but she knew that there was a presence there. She says she woke up at around 3 and had a strong urge to pray for him, and she did. My uncle kind of looks at me after that like, "Are you hearing this?" I honestly don't know what to make of all of this, but I wanted to share this here, and hopefully maybe somebody can share an opinion on what happened. This was about 3 years ago in Big Bend National Park. My friend, my husband, and I were all going on a trip to do some primitive camping. I'm not a hardcore camper, but I've done my share of primitive camping and hiking, so I like to think I have some wilderness sense. I know what common animals are, like having grown up in 8 acres of forested land. Coyotes were frequent visitors, so I know how creepy they can sound. That's why I know what we encountered that night was something else. We arrived at Big Bend around 4 p.m., checked in, and set up our camp at our campsite, 9 Point Draw. It's a pretty desolate location around the entrance to the park. The campsite is about 25 miles to the visitor center and lodge, and about 40 miles from the Rio Grande village. So we were not really near any kind of civilization. We had the idea that we would go for a night hike to a nearby trail after having dinner that night, so in preparation, I decided to scout out a trail from our campsite. The terrain in this part of the camp is totally flat desert with some ground vegetation, so we thought it would be an easy route for our campsite to the trail. The trek from our campsite was not difficult, but as an added precaution, I put up rock piles for us to follow that night. After dinner, we decided to head out at around 10 p.m. The first 10 minutes were pretty uneventful. We were all in good spirits. Suddenly, we hear a scuttling noise from about 50 feet behind us. Having been used to animal noises at night, we wrote it off as a critter. A few minutes later, we heard the same noises a bit closer, sounding like a bigger animal. There are black bears here, but we weren't in the area that they're normally sighted. Like I said, the landscape was wide open and we didn't see anything with our flashlights. We were a bit uneasy, but willing to go on. The rock piles had been doing a good job of leading in the right direction. All at once I stopped, feeling absolute terror. It's an indescribable feeling. I see many others reference this feeling, but it's so true. I knew we were in danger. I just didn't know why. I looked to my friend and my husband, who both looked terrified as well. There was no sound, no wind, and then in an instant, the most inhuman scream erupted, seemingly all around us. We all froze for what felt like minutes, but I'm sure it was just seconds. I don't remember making the decision to run back, but the next thing I remember we were all running. We had made it pretty far out, even though I thought I was running in the direction of our camp. I remember scanning for the rock piles. I remember not being able to find Eddie, and almost turning back thinking we were heading in the wrong direction, but had this instinct not to. We made it to a rather large rock I knew was on the route back to the campsite. I also remember putting a rock pile beside the rock. I went to check if it was there to make sure we were headed back to our campsite. The rocks were still there, but they had been knocked over. This set off all the alarms, and I told my friend and my husband that we had to get back to the camp as soon as possible. We made it back a few minutes later, and by the time I was back, I was entirely freaked out and didn't want to stay anymore. I think my husband was as well, but my friend convinced us that it was just wildlife. So we stayed in the tent that night. I don't know if it was connected, but there was scuttling and footsteps around the tent all night. Either way, I did not sleep. We did not do any more primitive hiking that trip and opted instead for a campsite in one of the community camps. I've never felt that feeling before or since, and I've been in the woods at night plenty of times. The next day I went out to check if all the rock piles had been knocked down, and they had. I don't think an animal would deliberately go around knocking over the markers. That's what really makes me think it was sentient. I don't know what it was, but I don't want to know, and I'm glad we made it out. As promised, I'm going to share another personal story of mine. Just to preface this isn't written down, this isn't me narrating, this is just me sharing one of my personal stories off the top of my head. And seeing as this is a national park video, I do have a national park story of my own. Well, technically it's a national forest, but I guess it's kind of the same thing. I was in the Daniel Boone National Forest with my little brother one day, and it was towards the end of the day. We were at this place where it's like a little bridge almost, and you could see like across this little creek, and there's like these bushes on the other side. And I remember just sitting there looking at it and getting ready to go walk to the entrance to meet our parents and get ready to go home and stuff. As we're looking there, my brother is throwing rocks across, trying to get them all the way across the creek. And I remember just seeing a set of eyes kind of just shine all of a sudden. And I was like, okay, that's kind of weird. I didn't think anything of it. But then I noticed that there was another set of eyes not too far away from that one. And I was like, okay, that's a little creepy. Maybe it's just some cats or something. Maybe it's something in the woods. Who knows, right? At this point, I have heard coyotes a million times living out in the middle of nowhere. I had seen them personally a ton of times, but I've never really been close to them, Never been like face to face or even, 50 to 100 feet away from them like we are at this point. Then I noticed that there's probably 6 or 7 sets of eyes glowing in the sunset light there. And I'm like, well, this is kind of weird. This is definitely not a comfortable situation. I hope this is not gonna be something I regret soon. So I begin getting nervous and get up and like, okay, we should probably start walking back now. Let's go meet our parents and get out of here. My brother's like, okay, sure, let me just throw one more rock, because he wants to try to make it all the way across. He hasn't been able to do it the whole time, so he's trying his best. This time, he surprisingly does make it all the way across, but as it lands on the other opposite bank, that's when we notice that all these coyotes are starting to sprint towards us across the creek. So we start running as fast as we can. At this point, I was in track and field for a couple of years. I had been pretty conditioned to just, get out of there and go for the long haul, and I could probably just run forever. My little brother at the time was really short. He hadn't hit his growth spurt yet, so he was probably like 4'2", something like that. And he could probably run pretty fast, but not for a super long amount of time because of his short legs. So we're probably running for a good quarter mile at this point and just going as fast as we can with these coyotes literally on our heels. It was insane. They were probably only about 100 yards behind us the entire time. my brother starts slowing down. So I have to literally make a choice decision to pretty much pick him up as I'm still running and carry him as we are just trying not to be eaten by these coyotes, I guess. This was probably the hardest task of my teenage years, to be honest, because at that time I was only like 85 pounds myself. I was really skinny and drastically underweight at that point. But, that's just how metabolisms be. But yeah, we start running, we keep running. I'm like, okay, I hopefully will be able to outrun him. It quickly becomes apparent that I'm not going to be, especially, carrying my brother. So I have to set him down, and I pick up this big stick that I happen to see on the ground. And I just start swinging this thing towards these freaking coyotes as they get close. And luckily enough, this is where the story, you think would climax and be super creepy, but gets better. As I'm swinging this branch, I'm like screaming on the top of my lungs, like, hey, like I'm for some reason doing something you would do to a bear. I don't know. But I'm just trying to scare them off, make me seem like I'm nothing to be messed with. And luckily, another person comes down and sees what we're doing, and they come and help me as well with another stick, and they eventually run off because they're a bunch of scaredy cats. That's how coyotes work usually. But it was a creepy encounter nonetheless. We ended up not being eaten by coyotes, and we ended up living. I hope you guys enjoyed this personal little creepy story of mine. Well, personal creepy encounter. Personally, being chased down was one of the creepiest things that's ever happened in my life.